originally we were joking that we were just going to talk about Gene this whole time. And so I've kind of been like figuring, that was kind of my initial premise for a little bit. And I was kind of asking a bunch of people what I should talk about. I think
who you should talk about.
Yeah, or who I should talk about. I think it really kind of like just talking to everyone. Everyone had all these suggestions. Like I should talk about some kind of like the venture capital stuff I do or startup stuff I do, or like how it relates to academics. I felt like, oh, that's all like kind of like dry sometimes and just like not interesting information. I think actually you asking me about Gene was like an interesting to kind of like think about what I want to talk about. I think the main thing I want to talk about was just like this idea of like people. I think that's like a very interesting concept. I think
people.
Like, as like a computer scientist, I think a lot of times we think about like automating stuff and we think about, you know, how the world's going to be with mostly computers, but we really don't realize that behind all that is like a person, right? And then kind of like a lot of the very interesting stuff that's actually being done like involve like some form of people or kind of like a group of people or kind of something like that. And I think kind of like that's like a very important aspect. Not to get like too philosophical, that, you know, there's something about like having humanity in kind of the technical stuff we do is like a very interesting concept that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, I think realizing more and more through grad school.
Yeah, that's an awesome topic. It's we'll vote for your video as the most likely to be outdated in 50 years when we're all robots and the singularity. They're like, oh man, Frank was such a fool. He thought people were important. Now we're all robots. I think that's an awesome topic. I mean, personally, because I do HCI, right? I do human computer interaction. That's like literally what I do, right? I think about how humans interact with computers. But, you know, you even bring a bigger point is it's not just humans interacting with computers, it's humans interacting with each other and these groups to make technology work. So, I mean, so what was on the top of your mind thinking about people and technology and such?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times people just ask me, they're like, oh, like you're a PhD student in like a pretty technical field. You do like security, big data systems, kind of like distributed systems, web services, kind of like all this like very complicated stuff. And on the other end, like you're doing all this like startup stuff where none of it is technical. And like why, like it's just like two different sides of your mind. And they're like, why do you like doing a lot of this like startup stuff, interacting with VCs? And interacting with these kind of startup founders. And I think there's something about kind of just dealing with people, I think is like something we I mean, I think maybe as this like computer scientist, we sometimes overlook or undervalue. Like the top of my mind is like, you know, when you were talking, we said we would talk about Gene, I was like very excited. I was like, fundamentally, I didn't know if it was a joke or like, what was it about? But I think it was kind of like, you know, just she is a person, like we got along, we talked.
I like that. I think that's the quote. She's actually a person. Good.
She's actually a person, like regardless of like, you know, we talk through technology a lot. I don't actually see her in person a lot, but you know, we talk and we have these conversations. And I think like these conversations are like very interesting and they like kind of ground us in some, I don't know, kind of like some either inspiration or they ground us in some like realization that like, you know, despite, you know, all this like crazy stuff we're doing with like, oh, we're like building these web services or this product, like it's sometimes very easy to forget like we're building something for people. Like if you really think about everything we do, there's a reason we do it. And fundamentally, it's something that deals with a person or a group of people, right? And so, I mean, I think this is more relevant for kind of like HCI where like you're building a computer and like or like an interface and you want to know how people interact with this interface and kind of have a good experience. But it's fundamentally about kind of like that person and how he or she feels. And so kind of like on top of my mind, I was like, oh yeah, like I'm interacting with founders, I'm interacting with like other business people, you know, there's kind of a lot of kind of this idea of people or involve a lot of people. And that's also very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's, I mean, it's, you know, not just with HCI in the academia, but also in industry. I mean, in the startup world and in business and launching products, that's very much interacting with people because in the end, if people aren't the one paying for your services or using it or excited about it, then you could build the most sophisticated, complex software system. And if no one uses it, then your business is not a success.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very interesting that you realize this. I think when I talk to a lot of PhD students, they kind of get caught up in the coolness of the technology or like the like slickness of the technology. And I ultimately kind of tell them, I was like, no, many times, like when you go into industry and you look at these products, like the best product isn't winning. And, you know, a lot of times, you know, people get baffled or like a PhD student starts a startup and they're like, why? And I think it comes down to a lot of it's about like relationships, and a lot of it's about kind of people feeling comfortable with the people behind the product to kind of like, there's some trust aspect, and really people have learned to kind of like trust each other more, surprisingly, to kind of like trust a technology that, even though, it might be rationally true, or rationally right, like the technology might, I can prove to you that this cryptography works, ultimately I'm trusting the person I'm talking to about it more than the actual technology itself.
Interesting. So do you mean this trust right now, you're thinking about in terms of like an investor investing in your company and trusting the founders, or like a trust between the users of your product and the people making it, or both?
I think it's all around. I think kind of when you talk to people about a lot of things, when it comes to like even startups or products or even research, I think a lot of it comes down to, people trusting the kind of person behind. Like if you talk to an investor, I find it hard pressed if you go to like an early stage venture capitalist, they say anything besides like, when you ask them, why'd you invest in this company? Very rarely is the first thing that comes up. It's like that it was the best product. It's always like, we love the founders. They have this vision and we bought into it. But that's all subjective, right? Like what's different between two people's visions? And it's like, do I like this person? Do I not? Like, do I kind of like relate to them in some way?
That's actually a really, really good point. It actually kind of ties back to academia in terms of like for grant writing and for, fundraising in academia, which is, there's some analogs to raising money in industry. And, in a way, a lot of the fundraising in academia, they try to pose it as more of a peer-reviewed meritocratic process, especially for like the NSF or the NIH, like these big government organizations. You submit a grant proposal and you get peer reviewed by just like a paper, right? You get a committee of 5 people and they review it and they discuss it and stuff. And then there's some kind of program officer oversight. But I think a big part of that, I think I tweeted about this, or someone else was tweeting about this, is that like a lot of your grant proposal is like showing why you're a good person to do this work. And the idea has to be interesting and new and whatever. But like you're saying, a lot of people could have interesting, good ideas, but it's like, half the grant or a third of the grant is just about your prior work and your credentials, and a lot of value signaling of like, I am, amongst the best person in the world to do this work because I've done this before. I have this software platform. I have this award, and then I want to do something new. Whereas, if the same person came up with your same idea, but they were an outsider in the field and they didn't really have the credentials or the prior work, it'd be much harder to sell that grant. So even in, in academia where we would want things to be more meritocratic based on the ideas, there's still a lot of that legacy based on the person. And that's why, people talk about why it's really hard for junior people to get grants, because if you have the exact same idea and pitch, someone who's more senior has a better chance just because they have a much bigger track record. They know how to frame things. They have partnerships and everything. And I imagine it could be similar in the world of business as well.
Yeah, I think that it's exactly kind of the same thing. I think there's even a lot of kind of subtle things that we kind of don't realize kind of regarding this, is that, a lot of times when you write a paper and you submit it, it's supposed to be double blind, and kind of it's supposed to be judged based on the quality of paper, but kind of that's actually a very subjective process, because people who've been on program committees kind of like know what other people look at, kind of like how this person will feel or how this community feels. Kind of like they have that intuition. Whether kind of they know this actively or not is kind of very different. But kind of like a lot of times, if like we write, like if I were to write a paper to a security conference, even versus a systems conference, like that paper can be written differently based on who's on the program committee, or like what that community believes, or what that specific conference is looking for. And a lot of that kind of goes back to like people getting intuition about the people involved in the process, right? And so that's kind of a lot of subconscious things. And it's not really like, who's better at what. It's kind of like, what does my intuition tell me about kind of the people involved behind the process?
Yeah, that's totally true. I mean, in academia, it's very much a social system, just like in business and everything. And I think, now that I've been in this game for quite a while now, it's like, I feel like some people have issues with it because they feel that academia should be this ivory tower of ground truth and, beauty and everything. But the real world is I don't want to say it's a business, but it's a social organization, just like everything else, right? You have a community, you have experts, you have veteran people, you have newcomers, you have people with money, you have people who are the gatekeepers of certain kinds of prestige and everything. Just like in business, there's people with money, there's customers, there's the media, there's a press you have to balance. So kind of being a kind of this platonic ideal of an ivory tower researcher is quite different than being a what I call professional academic, right? Like if you're a professional academic, you have to be aware of communities and how you write papers and grants and pitch your ideas and such. And it's a profession just like any other. I mean, if you're an engineer at a company, or if you're an entrepreneur or a person running a nonprofit, you have to not only be good at your craft, you have to understand all the social and political mechanisms behind it. And that's part of the job, right? And I think that some people, especially in grad school, I mean, I felt this way also, and I think a lot of people in grad school, they back then they didn't really see the bigger system around academia as a profession. They only saw their own small slice of it. So a lot of it doesn't seem to make sense. It's like, oh, we should just be seeking the truth and everything. But in fact, it is a whole career path and an entire profession, just like, in business, there's an entire profession to that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think kind of like the reason I brought up this kind of like people aspect is I think, as either academics, I think you kind of, touch on a lot of the facts because you've been kind of doing this for a while now. But I think as like a PhD student, when I talk to younger students or undergrads or people going into grad school, I kind of like every year when grad students come, they always ask the question, like, what kind of research do you work on? Like, what do you get to do in this lab? I think, and many times I think I've talked to kind of Neha has a really great blog on kind of like what you should ask. And a lot of it's not about the technical aspects. I think people should be, technical people should be asking more kind of social or people focused questions. Like, what is this lab like? What kind of like, what is the collaboration like? What is your relationship with your advisor? I think a lot of that gets lost because people are so worried about like, I need to go to kind of like the best lab, or like this lab has the most papers, like kind of these hard metrics, and they kind of forget, kind of the goal is, or kind of like when they go to this place, they have to like be interacting with people, they have to like build a relationship with people. And I think it's very easy as like a technical person to lose sight of like the humanity or like the people aspects of like a lot of these decisions that we're making, like just even every day. It's something as simple as like, what grad school do I go to? What company do I work for? A lot of it comes out should be, who am I working for, or what am I working in, or like who, like what is this group of community, what is this community like? Kind of by asking deeper questions along those lines, rather than just like these metrics are just like facts, right?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I mean, both for people starting in their PhD and also starting their first jobs. I mean, I think people are all around that same age, right? For the most part, you're like in your early 20s. You either choose to go to a PhD program for N years, or you have your first job in industry, whether as a product person or an engineer or a salesperson or whatever. I think I've made some videos about this, is that like when you're that kind of junior, I personally feel that if you have kind of raw talent and hard work ethic and everything, you're fairly kind of like a stem cell in a way. You're fairly undifferentiated, right? You're out of college. Yeah, you have the major in college and stuff, but like everyone is, I would say, at age 21 is kind of a generalist, right? You're a computer generalist, or, a generalist in business or whatever. You kind of are fairly much a generalist. And I think that, yeah, I totally agree with you that people sometimes get too caught up on the exact thing they want to do. It's like, oh, I know I want to do deep learning because I took a class at it, or I know I want to do, computer graphics because I took a class at it, or I did some research project and it's awesome. I really want to do it. But, what if the school you're going to for personal or social reasons, the computer graphics group isn't great, and there's another group that's awesome that's in a somewhat different area? But yet I would encourage people, it's perfectly okay to switch areas that early, because I think, like you said, investing in the social and the kind of people climate is so much more important, because your skills can change very well when you're that young. But investing in your own growth and kind of personal growth over time is just pays a lot of dividends, especially at that early age.
Yeah, I think also kind of a big part of this is when I think about it, is that a lot of kind of like what you do doesn't really come down to kind of like, your technical skills matter only to a certain extent. I think there's kind of like a barrier, like, you yourself, unless kind of like you're working on a very specific, well-defined, very difficult theory problem, for example. A lot of times, like the problem is very vague. You need kind of like a lot of different perspectives. Like, where do these perspectives come from? Like, it's impossible for one person to kind of, generate all these perspectives, right? Or all these like potential ideas. Like, that's why we collaborate as a concept. And I think, people forget about that a lot of times. It comes natural to them, where they don't have this like realization that like, I'm limited in my ability to kind of like even do research, regardless of how smart I am. Even the smartest person like wants to go out, hear different ideas, hear different thoughts. And so kind of a lot of it's like, you know, when you go out and you meet someone and you want to collaborate with them, like it comes down to this collaboration doesn't depend on like a marrying of like technical skills. A lot of times, like, can I work with this person effectively? And that's kind of like a relationship focused issue rather than like a technical issue.
Yeah, and I think that's the yeah, that's absolutely right. That the more I think about it now that I'm in the, you know, starting to get old category of, you know, I have this, you know, 10 years or more, because I finished college a bit over 10 years ago. I guess I finished my MA and my master's over 10 years ago in 2006. And it's been a nice case study to me personally to see where people are with their, you know, both their careers and then their personal lives and interests and stuff. And it's an interesting, I mean, I wrote a little bit about this of like, you know, these are the peers that we know from places like Stanford and MIT and, you know, very top schools. And, you know, like you were saying, everyone is way above the bar technically in terms of what they want to do, right? Like everyone's kind of raw intellect and work ethic and all the technical abilities that you can measure are, you know, way above bar for basically everything. And I think that the differentiator between people, how they've got, where they've gotten in their careers and lives in, I would say 10 years, in that first 10 years, is exactly what we're talking about, is the kind of both social and also interpersonal and ability to kind of look ahead and get advice from others. And a lot of this meta game thing, we call this like the meta game, right? Not really the exact game you're playing, but this kind of meta ability to look back and do stuff. And that is, I say that is one of the biggest differentiators, and I think that's the highest order bit. And it's something that's hard to teach people too, because if you're telling someone who's 21 to focus on this stuff, I find it's hard to teach them because they don't really see that looking ahead. So I guess the question for you would be, what would you tell someone who is right out of college and wanting to start grad school or their first job and stuff, knowing that they are so focused on being in a technical major? You know, how would you tell them to think about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit difficult. I think it took me kind of a while, and I don't want to say like I kind of fell into it, but it was kind of one of those things where I kind of realized it accidentally, and then kind of, you know, it's been going on. Like I never wanted to do all this startup stuff. I kind of like, I was interested in startups more from a technical perspective and kind of definitely non-business perspective, but kind of as I slowly did more and more of it, I realized that, you know, a lot of my kind of social skills I learned from college were becoming more and more important to kind of like interact with people, kind of like just actually care about what people think. Because now when people talk to me, even though I'm a PhD student, I think that's kind of the threshold for them to kind of think, hey, I'm talking to Frank. He's not going to say anything stupid. But I don't really want to ask him. I'm like very uninterested in kind of his technical kind of skills or like what he's working on technically in his research. A lot of times people are interested in like, what is your story? Kind of like, what is your inspiration? Kind of like, who do you interact with? Like, how do you think about things? Things like very subjective kind of things that kind of just deep dive into like, let me understand Frank as a person first, before kind of like moving on to like anything even business oriented or even technical oriented. Like maybe like in a conversation, whenever I talk to CEOs or CTOs, even like big companies, like the conversation about the technical stuff is maybe like 5 minutes, I would say. And they're usually like, they preface it like, it's been a while since I did anything technical. Like, can you just give me a brief rundown so I kind of have an idea of like, you know, how you fit into this like niche. But most of the time they're like, you know, where did you grow up? Like, you know, kind of like what perspectives you have on like a variety of issues that may or may not be related to technology a lot of times. So I think that's very interesting. And kind of like I've slowly realized this through many, many conversations with kind of these higher level people that, you know, this is like something that's actually like very interesting and relevant.
Cool. So actually, I guess in our last 10 or 15 minutes here, let's get pretty specific then. So we started really general, and you just mentioned this point about how you accidentally kind of fell into this thing through your technical work in your PhD, and then you're doing the startup thing and then doing that. So tell me a bit about, it's very meta, but tell me about that story in brief, right? How you got into it and what you're doing with the startup stuff specifically and how that progressed.
Yeah. So I think when I was at Stanford, it was kind of, this was before all this like crazy startup stuff was there at Stanford. I think now it's it's a lot crazier than it was
So what
before.
years were you at Stanford? I guess before the crazy.
I was at, it was like 2008 to 2012. And surprisingly, I try to tell people like 2010, my friends interned at Facebook. It was not a hip place to intern. It was like 100 people. The only reason people wanted to like they probably had 100 million users back then, maybe. And people wanted to only intern there because it was closer to go there from wherever people live than to go to like the Gates building, which is the CS building at Stanford. And so like when you stayed over the summer, like, oh, it's easier to go to Facebook. Let me like walk there 5 minutes rather than doing research. And kind of like that's kind of like the environment we're in. People were still like wanting to do double E, worried about outsourcing. Now it's like kind of a lot crazier. But I kind of always wanted to get more involved in startup stuff. But I guess like at Stanford, so much stuff was going on as an undergrad that I just didn't have time. But I knew like in the PhD, it would be more focused. And so I wanted to spend more time. And I came over to the East Coast. The East Coast was like nothing like it is now even. I'm like, it's hard to find startups you didn't really know. It was kind of like a closed community.
Seems like 2012, right? Around 2012
yeah,
at MIT, there wasn't
yeah.
that startup scene right around school, 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, like people, like these schools weren't thinking about entrepreneurship at all. Like MIT, I think, really ramped it up around 2014. And like Harvard really saw the potential come out of Facebook and their students go and do kind of more entrepreneurial things. Like we should provide some support earlier on. I think that was kind of their mentality. And so kind of it was hard, I think, long story, it was hard for me to kind of find stuff that was going on. And so, but there was a lot of student startups coming out and they're raising a lot of money, either both in California and in Boston, but not at this scale. And so I wanted to get involved somehow, either like on a consulting side or kind of just like help on a product, and just to kind of learn more like what does it mean to do a startup? What are the challenges?
So it was your own desire to do this. Like you had a desire for a while and you were waiting for the opportunity when you're at MIT in grad school.
Yeah, but I had no idea how this would manifest into like kind of like what would the day-to-day look like, or like what would this involve. I was like, I just want to get into a startup, see what they thought would be a good thing for me to do and kind of go from there. And then so I was looking around, couldn't find anything good. And then I stumbled upon this like venture opportunity that one of my friends that I took a class with at Stanford, actually, going back to this people thing, like we got along in class. He now worked for this VC firm called General Catalyst.
This was in California or in Boston?
So I took a class with him when I was at Stanford, and we were, I think he was a year older than I was, and he went out into kind of the venture world, and he went to General Catalyst, and then and I saw also at the same time, I saw an article on TechCrunch on this initiative called Rough Draft Ventures, which is like a student-run initiative out of General Catalyst, which funds student founders. And so I thought that was cool. I kind of like, at the same time I was catching up with him, I asked him about it. He's like, you should totally email this guy named Peter Boyce. He started it. You guys would get along, just like talk to him. And so I cold emailed him and I said, this sounds interesting. Can I learn more? And he's like, you seem cool. You go to MIT PhD, went to Stanford, like, let's chat. And that's kind of how this all started. And kind of like through that, I kind of got inspired by a lot of things. I think I ended up talking to Gene about kind of doing the cybersecurity factory that same year, around 2013, 2014. Kind of like we had conversations around this, and kind of like it just like exploded into me being more involved in the startup world, where kind of people were interested. I think people were intrigued by a PhD student interested in business stuff and startups, and kind of like having all these connections. I think kind of it just ramped up very fast. I don't even, like, now I reflect back on it, I was just kind of like going through the motions, but it's like there was just a lot of things that were going on.
So that was like the 2013, 2014 era. So what is this relationship with Gene and the cybersecurity factor and the rough draft VC thing? Like, how does that all fit together?
Yeah, so the rough draft thing I had started doing, and then I think, and then I became friends with Gene probably a little bit later that year. Kind of, I realized like she was one floor below me. She was friends with a lot of people in my lab. I was like, who is this Gene Yang person? Let me go talk to her. And we had a conversation. We talked about, security, startups. She was talking about her time at Facebook, and kind of she was asking me, she knew about this rough draft ventures thing because she also had one of her friends she went to college with at Harvard, Nitesh, also helped start it. And so she knew him. And so she was kind of curious, and she's like, this sounds interesting. There's something there. Do you want to get dinner? And then, so we got dinner one day, and then she's like, so I've been thinking more about what you've been saying, and like, what is it that really prevents kind of PhD students from doing more startups in cybersecurity? Like, very strange. I was like, network and money. And she's like, wait, is that all? And I said, yeah, but those are two pretty hard things. She's like, is there a way we can do like a summer program that we can just like provide these two things, or like help facilitate these two things? And I said, well, I have a couple of relationships. I'll float it by them. And then kind of like I went around to a couple of venture people that, wanted to connect with me because they're like, PhD student who's doing some venture stuff. We've never seen this. This is like a new concept to us. Let's talk to him. And I kind of brought up this idea, and they're like, one venture firm said, this sounds great. We're on board. 2 PhD students excited about helping other PhD students in a space that's growing and very innovative. We don't really know what's going on. And so, yeah, like let's have them try it. They seem like good people. They seem pretty smart. They know what they're doing. They kind of can figure things out, and like, let's go from there. And kind of like, that's kind of how it all started. Just with a couple of meetings where people met me for maybe 30, 45 minutes. And they said like, Gene and Frank, they seem like interesting people. They have like interesting perspectives that we don't have. They want to do this thing. Why not support them? And it's, it doesn't cost us that much ultimately. And they're like, oh, okay. And that's kind of how it started. I think, I think now I reflect back on it, those meetings were, we were talking to them were very kind of important, where they were kind of evaluating us like on our ability to like execute on the summer program.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome story, and it the way you tell it, it's very organic as well, right? You started with some desire, and then there was opportunities, and you kind of slowly carved outward. And yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. So for these sorts of places with a lot of money, it's not that much money to invest in a few people organizing some things, and for them, they can potentially learn a lot, right? Like if they can get into the space first and have expertise, goes back to our point earlier, is that if they invest in good people, and you too find, create something or find other grad students who are working on cutting edge security research that creates the next big company, that's a big win for them. And it's not a big loss either if it doesn't work out, because it's just not that much money in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. I think kind of like that was the mentality behind it. I mean, and of course, like things change over time. So I think this kind of, I slowly realized this after doing kind of this program for a few years, is that they really ended up investing in kind of like Gene and I had this vision about kind of helping younger entrepreneurs or first-time entrepreneurs. So it's now not just about PhD students, about first-time entrepreneurs or people who, were trained as an engineer, not too much business sense, like need help on that. And so that's kind of what the program has evolved to. But there was no way we could have predicted this kind of like 3 summers ago or 3 years ago. But they kind of saw us and they're like, these two people, they get along. They kind of work well together, have different perspectives. They'll figure something out. So they have some vision, like there's something there, and they believe in it. And so, we somehow convinced them that they should also believe in this. And so that's kind of like just how it all started. And now this is where we are. Kind of like, I think it's just one of those things where there's like an exponential growth curve where now I'm like regularly interacting with like CEOs of top security companies and companies with huge security practices, because we have this like mind share of like interesting ideas, both in academia and in industry, that like other people don't have, especially in an industry where, in security, where it's just like always new innovation, like every day.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So concretely, what is the day-to-day and stuff, and what is, I guess we have a few minutes left, is, what has it grown to at this point? What is the thing, and then what do you and Gene plan to do with it now that, she's a professor and then you're hopefully graduating soon and going on stuff, what is your vision for the next few years, how to keep this up and sustainable while you both have other jobs to do?
Yeah, I think so. Kind of where we are now is like we run a pretty kind of like lean program. It's a summer program, 10 weeks. We spend a lot of it working. We work with 4 teams every summer. We give them a little bit of money, and we give them this very extensive security network. So we have like top CEOs and CTOs at security companies like Rapid7, Akamai, Imprivata. And then we work with like CISOs, like the CISO at Twitter, like I'm in regular contact with. I'll shoot him an email. He'll like respond to me to kind of like run ideas past him.
This is a chief security officer, right? CSO,
yeah,
the chief security officer.
Chief information security officer,
right.
Yeah. And so kind of like that's where our program is. Like I spend most of my time kind of like building out the network now of security kind of professionals or executives who are interested in participating in this. And so there's really not too much day to day. It's kind of sporadic. It doesn't really interfere that much with my research. Actually, I think it helps a lot because I get to learn what's going on in the industry and see like if my problems that I'm solving have any application, or what are the interesting ideas or technically difficult things that industry is struggling with. And the executives are the people who really know. They're like, this is our 5-year strategy. Like we need to get there, and like here are the gaps, and they will know the best than like an engineer who's kind of just like working on writing some code on some program or some product. And so kind of like that's where we are. Like the program is growing. Like we're pretty stable. Like kind of like we try a couple of new things every year. Like this year we're trying to talk to more chief information security officers. and stuff like that. And so, I mean, it's pretty good. I think it's interesting. I've met a lot of interesting people along the way. I think I'll continue doing this. I think my potential job path or in academia or like something that will allow me to kind of like still be interacting with folks like this. But I think academia is definitely top of my list. And I think if I were academic, I'll either, we'll hire someone to kind of run more of the day-to-day operations or get, one of my students who's excited about it kind of work on it. And I'll still be like pretty heavily involved because I think these people are interesting. You never know what happens these days. A lot of these people, they're good to have my network. The program's like an excuse to maintain that network almost. And so I think, it's still going to keep going. I think we're at a place where a lot of kind of the growing pains are starting to go away. So there's less time kind of wasted on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And is this is the main bulk of the work in the summer? Is a summer program?
So I think the main bulk of the work is actually not in the summer because when the teams show up, I connect them to the network and the mentors do whatever they have to do. And I kind of like check in with them occasionally. Actually, I don't do that much in the summer. I think most of it's actually during the year where it's like going out, like and building new connections, finding teams. But that's kind of all that's not hard stuff. It's just a little, it takes some time, but time, you can create time as like Gene said, like if you just effectively manage it. So
yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think, if both of you are in academia, it's actually very, if you both of you are professors, that's actually very amenable to doing something like this. Cause it's not like you are trying to, I think it's very hard to be a professor and to head a exponentially growing organization where the next week you have double the number of employees and you're heading like a 300-person organization. But for this thing, it's more of a consulting and networking model where you don't have an exponential growth in the number of things you do. You kind of manage it, keep it growing steadily, and it's very, very possible to do this at the same time as your academic job. And if you're both presumably going to stay in the information security, that area of research, I think it's a really, to me, I think that's even a higher leverage thing than some of the colleagues we know who are starting as professors and they have a startup as well, that they have one startup they're doing. I think what you and Gene are doing actually opens more possibilities because you're kind of like we were saying earlier, like you're kind of playing the meta game above everything because you can be in touch with all these different companies. Whereas, our colleagues who are faculty who are running one startup, they have to be really laser focused on that one product.
Yeah, I mean, I think I look at this almost like kind of like your podcast and a lot of your writings is like kind of this side activity that, I really should be doing. I think professors should be interacting with industry to kind of see how their work, or even grad students should be talking to, important people in industry who have like decision-making ability so that their research actually has impact. Like this kind of goes back philosophically, like why do we do research, right? I mean, we do research because we think, there are problems that need to be solved, but, if there are only problems that academics think are interesting, like what is it some people will agree like that might be interesting research, but I'm kind of the type of research I'm interested in is like very impact focused. Like I want people to use it. I want people to like not even use it directly, but learn something from it. So they would say like, hey, you really changed my perspective on how I should go and solve this problem because I didn't know X existed or Y existed, or I couldn't solve Z. And so I think, kind of having industry academic relationships, especially in something like security, where an enemy, which is the hacker, right? And so it's like important to have that collaboration. We're not like on two different sides. Like everyone can benefit from kind of having a better kind of information share.
Yeah, that is awesome. I think it's an awesome note to end on. Yeah, I think we covered a ton of topics. So thanks again. We'll talk a little bit more offline. So